Several weeks ago, the major oil sands producers introduced or launched the Oil Sands Net Zero by 2050 Pathways Initiative, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage plays a very large role in it. The Wood Mackenzie, the international consultancy, recently released a study on Canadian CCUS efforts and technology and so on. And I'm going to talk to Scott Norlin, who's one of the authors. So welcome to the interview, Scott.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Look, why don't we start with a brief overview of your study, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot to unpack. I'll try not to talk for too long, but generally what we did is we took a bit of an un-Canadian approach. As you mentioned, CCUS is a growing topic across the world, and something that Canada's done really, really well is actually been innovative on this front. There's quite a few firsts and largest that Canada can kind of put its name to. So some of those are the largest operating commercial CO2 EOR and sequestration project, that's in Weyburn, the largest operating CO2 pipeline by capacity, that's the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, the first coal CCS retrofit at Boundary Dam, the world's first refinery built to include carbon capture from the onset, and then the first commercial carbon sequestration applied to an oil sands upgrader at Quest. We also kind of talk about the enablers, where do we come from, how did we get to there? So there's been a lot of government support, specifically from the Alberta and Saskatchewan governments, as well as the federal government. There's also a lot of industry collaboration that's been ingrained in the culture of the industry in Western Canada. So looking at COSIA, CRIN, and as you mentioned, the Oil Sands Pathways to Net Zero initiative. This type of collaboration is really similar to something like the Acorn project in the North Sea, where you're having a lot of stakeholders kind of come together to participate together.
Well, let's talk about the economics. Now, I've interviewed a number of experts over the last couple of years about carbon capture and storage, and the message, I think, has been fairly consistent that this is technology that is getting better. It's getting closer to being economic, but it isn't economic yet. And so what can you tell us about the economics of carbon capture and storage?
Yeah, the economics are challenging, but again, looking specifically at the projects in Canada, take a look at Quest, for example. So Quest is, a pretty impressive project, but Shell's also come out and said that they gold plated it, right? So they basically overspent by 30%. So if they were to redo the same project today, they would be able to cut costs by 30%, which has a pretty significant impact on those economics. And again, the government funding plays a role in supporting these projects, taking risk away from the private sector companies that are starting them. So I think public funding for these projects and partnerships between government and industry are going to be really key. An interesting company is Entropy. They're a relatively new entrant, but they've been very, very busy. We were able to talk to them not too long ago, and they're planning to add, or in the works to add, up to 1.2 megatons of sequestration by sort of the middle of the decade here, and their costs are pretty low if you look at that. So I think there's people who kind of view CCUS in different ways. So there's the standalone facilities that are brand new and have to be built from scratch. And then there's sort of the bolt-on method, which is more what Entropy is looking at. So I think, ingenuity, you can never really count out human ingenuity. And Canada's in a bit of a special place just because we have so much of the engineering and geologic expertise to potentially do that.
Well, we'll get to government support for these CCS projects in a moment, but let's talk about the role of the carbon tax. Now, we're on an escalator to go from, I think we're at $50 a ton now in Canada up to 170 by 2030. But what isn't, I think, broadly appreciated is that within the tier scheme in Alberta, it's as a discount applied of 80 to 90% based on output-based allocations. And so the actual impact of that carbon tax the full impact is not felt by the oil sands producers. What do you expect, what role, what impact do you think that carbon tax will have on on the economics of CCS?
Yeah, so I mean, the escalating carbon tax definitely helps, right? If you can sequester a barrel or sequester a ton of carbon and make some money off of it, that's definitely going to help the economics. And as that ramps up relatively quickly here in the next 9 years, to reach that 170. That's going to be, a pretty material difference. Yeah, the whole tier program, like you mentioned, it's the benchmarking system that they have in place. We're going to have to wait and see kind of how the governments, both at the federal and provincial levels, are going to negotiate that contract or the agreement there and equivalency. But yeah, the systems are definitely going to be affected by the carbon tax.
Well, let's talk about government support now. The projects that that you mentioned, like Quest, have had significant government support, wouldn't have gone ahead without it. And we didn't really have a number attached to what it might cost after the Pathways Initiative was announced. But yesterday, there was an article in the Calgary Herald, an interview with Mark Little, CEO of Suncor, and Alex Pourbet, CEO of Cenovus, and they floated the idea of $75 billion. And I have to tell you, that's a big number. And, for a government to come to the table with, and what's your take on that? I mean, I can see that being a bit of a stumbling block.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a big ask. And you're right. When they came out with the initiatives press release, I was digging around for numbers too, because I wanted to see how much they expected to spend. Yeah, you're right. Suncor, Mark Little did come out and say a number. They actually announced that a couple weeks before in another podcast. If you were sneaking around, you could find it. But yeah, so it's 75 billion to 2050. So it sounds really big right now from where we're standing, but they're asking for 2.5 billion a year, ish, give or take, right? It'll always fluctuate. It's never going to be a perfect rounding number, but it still is a big bite. And asking, that partnership too is going to have to be negotiated between the industry and the government. So the absolute percentages that it ends up being and all those sorts of things are going to be interesting to see. It has in the podcast that I was referencing, they did actually kind of talk about 50% all the way up to 75% of government funded. So there is sort of an estimate there. But at the same time, I do think that if the government was willing to invest in this, they are protecting, I think the GDP contribution of oil and gas in Canada was somewhere around $75-80 billion in 2019. The 2020 numbers aren't totally out yet, but so it's a relatively minor investment when you're talking about the scale of the industry. And if we want to compete globally for sort of the green barrels, these are initiatives that are going to have to be pushed both by the industry and supported by the government.
Well, let's wrap up this interview, Scott, with a more technical question. So we have the expertise. Canada, the industry has experience with a variety of projects at some scale. But now we're going to talking about an industry, a sector of the oil and gas industry that generates 80 megatons of CO2 a year. That's big scale. And I wonder, I think it's a fair question to ask whether or not CCS at that scale is going to be, more of a challenge than the industry expects.
Yeah, I mean, to say that all your eggs are in one basket, if we look at the pathways, right, that S it kind of sneaks through, but I think it's an important one to focus on. So CCUS is going to be a large component. They've talked about up to 70 megatons, and so that's a big number. I don't disagree. That's roughly 10 times what Western Canada is currently sequestering. So it's a big initiative. It's a big driver for sure. But the other side of that, they're also talking about using hydrogen as fuel, and hydrogen fuel cells for vehicles, which are fuel switching and stuff like that would also play a role. So I think there's no one-stop option to kind of fix the whole problem. I think CCUS is going to play a role, and I think people are kind of focused on that one just because we have the experience, we know how to do it to an extent. So that one is maybe the closest within reach. So they're holding on to that one or pushing for that one right away. And then the technologies that they're developing on top of that, they're hoping will kind of fill the gap.
Great. Scott, really appreciate your insights on this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks again.